Hi everybody, my name's Dr. Jenna Conde. I'm a Senior Lecturer in Digital Society at Western Sydney University. I would like to acknowledge that I'm recording this video on the lands of the Darug and Gundungurra people, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students who are participating in this learning experience with us as well. And yes, that sovereignty is never ceded, and that has implications for how we are living, learning and working digitally and materially. And it's important to consider those implications within this Curiosity Pod on identity. And on that note, it's really, really great and wonderful to welcome Professor Bronwyn Carlson, who is a professor and head of Department of Indigenous Studies at Macquarie University. Hi, Bronwyn.
Hi, thanks for having me on this podcast. It's really interesting.
So I'll just kick off with the first question, just around Indigenous activism globally having a strong and growing web presence and influence across social media platforms. So I was going to ask you about how that's playing out in the Australian context, and what are the possibilities for Indigenous Australians with their social media use?
So in Australia, what in terms of activist, in terms of activism, I should say, we have to think about Indigenous identity in a political way. The very fact that you're an Indigenous person engaged in online spaces is already political, and it's already regulated in certain ways by outside forces, which we'll talk a little bit about. I guess some of the most significant platforms that are being used at the moment would be Facebook and Twitter for activist type activities. But I think that we also should think about the platforms generationally. So we see a lot of sort of more family and community type activists taking place on Facebook. So it's more community orientated. And on Twitter, we see more a higher level of kind of political voice. But there are a lot of younger generations, which pleases me no end to see, who are using all the sorts of platforms in their activist activities. And they use it to distribute their art, which is highly political, music, comedy, a whole manner of things. And there are so many fabulous ones that you can follow. And they're using, Instagram and TikTok and other platforms, and across all platforms as well, not just one or two, to have a profile and to really be part of the bigger conversations. Social media has been wonderful in the fact that it's overcome distance. So we're like around 3% of the population. We're spread out right across this continent, although there are pockets where there are many more of us, and Western Sydney is definitely one of those. We're able to connect collectively, so that amplifies our voices, which is really important. So, often we can be the only, Indigenous person in the room or at the event, or all those types of things. So social media brings us together in this kind of much bigger collective, but not only locally, nationally, internationally. So we connect with Indigenous peoples in this global space as well, which is really, really important, because collectively we make up a huge number of people, and often our concerns are very similar. The locations might be different, but the concerns are very, very similar. The other thing is that we can rally support in real time. So when something's going down, people can post that and people can turn up. So there are warnings that I've seen get placed on there, like police are arresting people at a particular place, or trouble is coming in some way, form. So there's this real life component to social media, which is really, really interesting. It also is providing a way to hold mainstream media and police accountable for their comments and their brutality, so their actions. So we've seen that where bystanders are posting the actions of police, but we also call out media when they're really overly racist towards Indigenous people. So it's provided a place where this can take place, historically before social media, and there was a time before social media. I grew up in a time when there was no internet, which sounds pretty old to most. But there, before social media, mainstream media held all the power, and they still wield a great deal of power, but they held a lot of power in what could be known and what could be voiced in public places. So now social media allows Indigenous people to have a voice and speak back there, which is really powerful. But the constraints are always the ways in which these platforms operate. Mm-hmm. So they're not designed for the benefit of users. Our data, of course, is valuable, and it's taken from us. So what happens to the data about us? And so if I think about that, how on your social media page, if you're discussing a particular topic, suddenly all kind of media or ads all come up about that topic, or if you search on Google for a particular product or something, suddenly all the ads are about that. So when I think about Indigenous people and some of the things that we search for and engage with, is often around quite traumatic events. So we're looking up the deaths of our community members at the hands of police, so we might look up those kinds of things. So then if we think about how the algorithms work, then they keep reminding us of those things. So we're constantly in this space where there's traumatic content for us as well.
Yeah.
And there's also so many racists and trolls, and engaging them with takes a real toll. So, being in contact and engaging with the stuff is dangerous for your health and well-being as well. So whilst we're actively on there, we're actively participating in identity and community building, we're also targeted constantly in those spaces, which, it really does take its toll.
Yeah. It's this, one of the things that we've been talking about is that it's like a bit of a double-edged sword, but, there's some really good possibilities for different communities to find each other and to work together, and then you've got all this other stuff in the way that the platforms are operated, governed and managed that make it a really tricky and, like you said, a traumatic experience to be online, and what the algorithm is going to feed you on that day. And so thinking about sort of moving towards those more ethical practices in social media as well.
It's really important for people to understand that these sites are not neutral spaces, that people have, so we do have agency, but our agency is constrained by the purpose of the platform itself. And so that is to gather data, gather information about us, to sell us stuff. So it's a capitalist enterprise. And so when we are saying to the platforms, they need to ensure that their policies, etc., are framed in such a way that there's some safety for the users, it really is kind of an oppositional approach to what the platforms are there for, because they're there to see all the dirt in the world and to see how they can make use of that data and sell it. And also when we ask platforms to consider their policies around dehumanization or racism, etc., what we're doing is reducing those kind of issues to a policy. A policy can rectify racism in a society where it's systemic. And so a policy won't rectify that. So thinking about the platforms and hoping that they will somehow make these places, more human-centric or more caring about the people I don't really think that's possible.
So on that note, one of the questions that I did have was around, if we got the opportunity and if we could or if we can redesign social media spaces with underpinned with Indigenous knowledges and practices, what might that look like and how could we get there?
Well, some time ago, the National Centre for Indigenous Excellence there in Redfern set up a sort of like a social media platform where it was just for Indigenous people only. But the problem with that, I love that idea, and this was some time ago, but the problem with that is our families and our friendship networks in the broader world is not always just Indigenous. So making it a space where only Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people can be together doesn't allow for the innovation that we practice out there in the world amongst a whole bunch of people. But I wonder if they revisited that now. This is many years ago, like a few years ago, and how things change. People might be ready for that. So I think that if we were to design and manage, social media spaces based on our own philosophies, I think it would look a whole lot different. And I was asked recently at a conference, would I pull the plug on social media? And I said, yeah, in a heartbeat, an absolute heartbeat. So while I see the great things that it affords us, and I also know the way it's shaping society, but I'm not really sure if that's better. If it's better than, but I also understand how our voices were silenced before, and this has provided that opportunity. But I also wonder, like, what does it equate to then? Having an amplified voice and then the toll it takes. So there's some equity in that space. So because I know it's not about people and it's not people-centered, that bothers me. So it's about capitalism. And anything that's about making money and providing power to certain people or companies, etc., is not really a good thing, and it doesn't benefit us as people, as humanity. So if it was designed based on our philosophical understandings of the world, then it would be more about connectivity and inclusiveness, and would also have responsibility and obligations. So if we thought about our government, if it was human-centered, if it cared about the people and country that it's supposed to do, then they could create social media spaces that operated without advertisement, without a capitalist agenda, where just allowed people to communicate and connect. And then it might have a different appeal to it. So while social media is providing this powerful tool of connection, what we see is people are lonelier than they've ever been. That tells me it's not that good.
Yeah, we've been talking about the concept of loneliness, and Q&A was on about the loneliness this week, and technologies amplifying that in some ways and connecting people, but then like reworking what it means to be alone, I think, as well. Yeah, so we're really compromised, and we've got this sort of trade-off going on with social media, with it giving us visibility and giving communities that need that visibility and voice, but then as you say, all this data is being used. And
I mean, social media has provided not only just for Indigenous people, but groups within Indigenous people. So I'm well aware that some elders don't have capacity to be out and about all the time, and certainly COVID has made this really visible for us all. But if COVID had ended, it still impacts people. So financially, to move about in the world, it costs money to do that, not just your time and energy. And so a lot of people, social media has provided that way to connect with other people. And like I said, it sort of stops the distance and allows us to be engaged with what's happening in the world as well, which is really, really important. But for LGBTQI mob, also, social media has provided places where communities can be built, which is really important, because even in Indigenous cultural context, there's a lot of trans, queer and homophobia, because Christianity has had this major impact on our communities as well. And so these ideas of what constitutes gender and sexualities has been framed in that way. So a lot of Indigenous people who identify as queer, might live in smaller towns and places, and the homophobia, even in their family and community, can be at such a sort of level that they want to move to a bigger centre. So a lot move to places like Sydney, for example, because you can have some sense of being an anonymous in this place, but connect with other people who have left their communities for those purposes as well. But so social media provides a place where people can meet and express their gender and sexual identities in a more safer space. But I do want to underline safe space, because social media is not that place, because it is rampant with misogyny, queer phobia, transphobia, etc. But people can create closed groups and safer groups for themselves.
So it's sort of moving into those more private controlled, curated spaces to be able to be more yourself in a way.
Yes.
With your people. Yeah. Something you mentioned earlier was around sort of creative practices and using social media for sharing art, political art, getting the message through in that way. Can I ask you a bit more about that? Because next in this part of the pod, we were thinking about taking up the new identity position of social media maker and a digital curator, you know, and sort of making and playing with social media and being creative.
Yes. So and if we think about young Indigenous, content makers, how they're using the spaces, we can see some fantastic examples. And so I really like Charlotte's work. So she's on, Charlotte is on across all the media platforms, but you can check out their work on Instagram, and their handle is @coffinbirth.
Yeah, I follow Charlotte. I've got one of her prints actually.
Like fantastic political work.
Yeah.
And even at Macquarie in our department, we contract Charlotte to design our posters, or we'll purchase some of their already existing work. Because what I love about their work is that it's not a focus on a significant gendered profile or Indigenous profile. So you could take Charlotte's work and apply whatever identities you require to that. So it can be for women's things, men's things, youth things, queer things.
Yeah.
It has this beautiful way of just expressing humanness, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So yeah, Charlotte's work is fantastic. Molly Hunt, also another fantastic artist and content maker, and their handle is @MollyHunt and then 4, so the number 4, food. So Molly Hunt for food. So Molly also is a fantastic artist, and we've used Molly's work as well. But their stuff is really highly political and really savvy, and I really love that they're edgy, the way in which they challenge things. So you mentioned the paper that Ryan and I wrote about memes, and one of the places we looked at was Blackfella Revolution, which is another site and handle that you can follow. And they had produced a series of memes that were really challenging colonialism, or challenging the sort of well-known narrative of Australian history. So those memes were, so they would take images of pictures of the stolen generation and add some really quirky and really thought-provoking text to it to get you to think about, if we think about Australian national sort of narrative, it's around peaceful settlement, it's around no frontier wars, it's around terra nullius, nobody's here, it's around all of these kind of things which we know are not true. So Blackfella Revolution took this whole series of images to tell the entire story of Australian history thus far, and really point out the contradictory nature of those stories, as opposed to the realities. So, how can you say that there is a peaceful settlement and no war when you've got actual colonizers' paintings and representations of them killing Aboriginal people, or images of Aboriginal people in neck chains and being imprisoned? And so this is not a peaceful space at all. It is a problematic space. And so, yeah, that series of memes actually highlighted that. So, yeah, looking at Indigenous sites and looking at Indigenous handles, I think is a really great way for students to begin to engage in a more, in a larger political landscape around Australian history and futures. I mean, that's one of the important thing about some of this work, is it really highlights Indigenous futures. Because if we think about the way in which Indigenous people are always written about or thought about, it is quite historical. So it's always like back in the day, before colonisation, everything is historical, as if we don't exist in the present or have aspirations to exist in the future. And so what I love about all of the contemporary activism that you see on social media from some of our young people is very futuristic.
And the continuity of Indigenous identities and communities. It's not sort of done.
Yeah.
So it's continuing the stories and challenging that mainstream.
Absolutely.
So one of the questions I did have was around what allies and non-Indigenous people can do, following the lead of Indigenous people that are using social media to shift the needle, the dialogue, and to instigate change. How can we best engage and support?
Yeah, I guess that in recent times, what we've seen is a rise of non-Indigenous people wanting to work out how they can be allies in these spaces. And I think that was really brought to the fore because of the Black Lives Matter movement. Because people were like, what can we do? And there were some issues raised on social media around. So the Black Lives Matter movement comes out. We see that there's systemic racism in all these kind of institutions. So people want to educate themselves on race and racism. So everyone ran out and bought non-Indigenous authors who wrote about race and racism. And so it was raised on social media then by Indigenous people saying, well, if you want to be a good ally and educate yourself, why is it that you've run out and only want to listen to non-Indigenous voices? You need to be listening to Indigenous voices as well. So that was really raised, really loudly on social media, and continues actually. So asking people, what is a good ally and what is a performative ally? So a performative ally is just going through the paces and actually wants praise for what they do, where being a good ally or being an ally that's productive is a little bit different. So there are lots of things that people can do. So if you aim to be an ally and support Indigenous social movements, one of the things we did see in the Black Lives Matter movement was a lot of non-Indigenous people on the streets also. And I saw in one case, non-Indigenous people moved themselves forward so that they became the buffer between Indigenous people and the police. And so there are actually like physical things you can do, but I understand not everyone is out on the street and don't have the capacity to do that. So you can actually follow lots of Indigenous people online and retweet, and not retweet with a sort of humble brag about yourself that you're doing something good, but retweet the voices of Indigenous people so that they're heard, as opposed to seeking some sort of limelight for yourself. So, you can retweet this stuff, but be educated. I mean, that's one of the really great things. And my colleague, Dr. Tristan Kennedy, wrote an article about racism and how lazy it is, because people just want to, I'm not racist, I want to operate in this space, but are really lazy in educating themselves. Like, what is it that you want to, be part of? Do you want to actually live in a world where these injustices take place, where humans are less valuable than commodities? Or do you want to live in a place where there's some equality and where we're not seeing these oppressions of particular groups? Because, like, if we think about it, white supremacy and the way it operates, it doesn't actually benefit all white people either. So it's only beneficial to a few. So if the majority want to have live in a world that there's more equality and there's more share of everything for everyone, then you need to educate yourself more around the way in which Indigenous people might view the world, because it is really quite different. Don't demand the limelight. Let others have the platform. Let them be heard. Retweet Indigenous voices. Follow Indigenous people, but also hear what the issues are. But educate yourself, and that was Dr. Kennedy's paper that he wrote, I think it was in The Guardian. He wrote specifically about how lazy we have actually become, that we don't understand our own history in this country. We don't understand how racism operates. We still buy into that idea that everything is in the past, and we can't see a correlation between past actions and policies and how they still operate today, even though it is like blatantly laid out for us. So those past policies of child removal, we can still see in contemporary times the same thinking applies, and they're removing children. So, you have to understand the history to be able to function productively, I think.
Yeah. I think what you said at the very beginning as well about being Indigenous is, a political identity. And so, being white is a political identity, and sort of acknowledging that, and it's not the universal position, and and it's an identity position that you need to work through and unpick the implications of, and how that's how are we doing whiteness in social media platforms. And like you said, like with the being on the street, you can step in social media spaces as well.
Yeah, you totally can. And, you know, I think if you plan to operate as anti-racist, so it's something that you will not tolerate, you won't participate in it, you won't stand by and see it, you don't want to live in a world where that actually gets to function. And so people go, well, I don't want to get in a fight with everyone all the time, but you can merely say to someone, excuse me, but you have mistaken me for someone who thinks like you, and I don't. And you can remove yourself from being part of it. Standing by and remaining silent also gives the people the power to keep going, and they feel like they can keep going because they have an audience. And if you're part of that audience, you're part of the problem.
Yeah.
Think about how decolonization works. You know, the worst thing about colonization is it limits our imagination to think about solutions in the future. And that's the purpose of it, because there is not supposed to be a future for Indigenous people. So colonization actually limits the way non-Indigenous people can vision a future that is shared with Indigenous people also. So if you really want to live in a world that is better, you need to think about it in terms of decolonizing your thinking. So how do you then become an agent for that kind of change? And you can only really do that when you educate yourself. Like, I had a student just recently say to me, I can't believe that you think white people get privilege. You're just racist saying that to me. And this is a white person saying this to me, that I'm racist against them because I believe that white privilege exists. And so that tells me that person has no concept about what we're talking about, how white privilege operates. And that's the fact that white people can step in front of the police and have some confidence that you're not going to get a beat down for it. So you're certainly not going to get a beat down because you're white. And so those are the differences. So to understand how white privilege works, and it's not a personal attack on non-Indigenous people. It's, if you understand how these systems work, then you can subvert them and you can choose not to operate and benefit from them. So those are the important things. So education is hugely important for people. So before you even go forth and, going to be an agent of change in social media spaces, work out what the history is in this country and how it operates around the world, because then you will really be able to come from a decolonized position.
Yeah, and a much stronger sense of what it is that you're doing and why. Yeah. I think as well.
Really, before you post and before you think about posting, just ask yourself a simple sort of question: is what I'm about to post will hurt anybody in any manner, and am I value adding to the world? Like, what am I posting here? Because I think a lot of stuff that goes on online is quite superficial and pointless in the world. Like, is what you look like and how many likes you get more important than tackling some of the major social problems that we have in the world, or understanding the world differently? I don't think so. And it really doesn't make people feel any better by getting 50 likes. It makes you feel better to know that you're value adding to the world as a productive person, an agent of change. I think you get a great deal more satisfaction out of that than getting 20 likes because you've had your hair done.
I know, yeah. We've been talking about looking at who we're connected to and how they shape what we can share. Yes. And then, if you change your audience, can you shift your social media use in the direction that you want to go as well?
Here's a little bit of research that they did on Instagram posts. And so I often work with Facebook or Twitter or Instagram on thinking about the way in which they can make those places better. So one of the things that they do know is that if you are just mindlessly scrolling through and, not really engaging with anyone, your mood will actually be lowered. But if you're actually engaging with somebody in a productive way, so having a conversation, connecting with actual friends that you know and have a relationship with, people's mood actually increases. So that tells us something about just being engaged with hundreds of people that you don't know. It doesn't make you any less lonelier or any less or any more happier in the world. It makes you lonelier and less happy. So being engaged in actual relationships, which is really central to Indigenous philosophy, is relationality. So your relationship with people is the most important thing.
Yeah, that's it. I completely agree. And just trying to work out who you want to be working with and talking with and supporting, and as you move forward with social media and in your life.
And, you know, you don't want to become a meme, so you might want to be a decent human.
Yeah, so that's a good note to end on. Thank you very much, Bronwyn.
Thanks.